So this afternoon, we have our panel exploring career paths and avenues to success. And I'll pass it over to Sarita.
Thanks so much, Riley. It's my pleasure to introduce our list of panelists this morning. I'm going to start with Charu Kaushik. Charu is a tenured full professor in the Department of Pathology and Molecular Medicine at McMaster University in Hamilton. Her research interest is in women's reproductive health, specifically basic clinical and translational research examining susceptibility and immune responses to sexually transmitted viruses, HIV-1 and HSV-2. I won't take away any airtime reading your complete bio, Charu, because it's phenomenal. And I think a better use of time would be for you to share about your journey. So please don't hold back your secrets about how you've accomplished everything that you have to this day. So I'll leave it to you there.
Thanks, Rita. I thought you were going to introduce everyone first, but that's fine. So good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Very nice to be here again this year. I think we missed last year, but it's a recurring feature, so very nice to be here. Thanks for the invite. So my name is Charu Kaushik, as Sarita said, and I am a professor at McMaster University in Department of Medicine, but in my other hat, among multiple hats that I wear, I'm also the scientific director for the CAHR Institute of Infection and Immunity. I'm happy to provide a little bit more details into that, what that role involves. But as a researcher, as you can all imagine, I run a research lab, I train students, I participate in teaching. But as the scientific director for the Institute of Infection and Immunity, especially in the last 2 years, my role has been to really prioritize areas for investments in the area of infection and immunity research. So as you can imagine, COVID-19 has made my institute extremely busy figuring out Canadian research priorities nationally and internationally. And I think among the 26 initiatives that CAHR has launched to support funding for research, we've supported or led in about 17 or 18 of them. So it's been a very busy time for us to help guide Canadian research through the last 2 years. As far as my journey to where I am today, which is I think part of what you're asking about, I'm an immigrant to this country. I came here about 29 years ago. I did my PhD in India at the National Institute of Immunology. I did a postdoc at Dartmouth Medical School in mucosal immunology. And then joined the team, McMaster team at that time, which was, sort of the mecca for mucosal immunologists to work in. So I joined the team in the viral vaccine division and then branched out into the HIV world, which was not work that I had done during my graduate training or postdoc. And among the many things that I have learned over the last 25 years is particularly the lessons learned from integrating community-based research into my very basic biomedical research. So I'm one of the few people who was an early adopter of community-based research integration into my own research. So again, happy to elaborate on that and the advantages of that. So, in my role as the scientific director for III now, that's an area that's very close to my heart that I am pushing a lot for people to integrate into their own research, the community-based and people with lived and living experience voices into that. So I'll stop there because I know there are other people who need to elaborate as well.
Thanks so much, Charu. So you might know the next presenter I'm introducing is the current president of CAHR, and he was also our first presenter this morning and set the bar very high for all subsequent speakers. Keith is a full-time professor and head of the Department of Medical Microbiology and Infectious Disease at University of Manitoba. He's also cross-appointed with the University of Nairobi's Department of Medical Microbiology. Keith, I'll also leave it to you to describe your very important research agenda and impressive journey that led you here today.
Great, thanks. And I appreciate my mother writing that introduction for you. I'm happy to join you again. For those that weren't able to make the first session, I'm Keith Folk. I'm professor and head of the department at the Department of Medical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases at the University of Manitoba. My lab studies primarily the immune system in the context of viral infections such as HIV, influenza, and SARS-CoV-2. A large part of our work is also involved with community partnerships, both in Nairobi, Kenya, as well as here in Winnipeg. I received my Bachelor of Science degree honors in microbiology from the University of Manitoba. And then I did graduate work at the Department of Medical Microbiology at the U of M, where I got my PhD. Then I postdoced in Gene Shear's lab at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And then I worked in industry just for a year, working with a company that was developing assays for the one of the earliest and first HIV vaccines that was attempted. So did some work with industry and then came back to work in academia as a professor. And that was 22 years ago that I came back and started my academic career. So I've been at it for a while. So I'm, although I'm sort of planted very firmly in the academic stream, in our department, we have lots of colleagues who are an important part of our department who are based at based at government research labs, and also some that are based in industry. So although my own experience is primarily a little bit of industry, but primarily academia, I'm also aware of other opportunities for researchers that aren't in academia, but that link in with academia. And I think there's lots of great potential for different career paths, as you'll see from the other panelists who will introduce themselves. Thanks, Rita.
Thanks so much, Keith. It is my great pleasure to introduce Terry Howard. He's the principal consultant at Glasshouse Consultants. His bio reads that he's worked with people living with HIV since the 1990s, providing support, advocacy, and community-based research capacity building. And he's also a past member of the CAHR Board of Directors and past presenter at the New Researcher Workshop. I've been actually privileged to work with Terry for over a decade on a lot of initiatives. And I've lost count of how many times I've called upon him to put out a fire. And Terry, you've definitely inspired me to be the kind of researcher that I'm still evolving. So I'm so excited that you are here to inspire another set of new researchers today. So I'll leave it to you. Steal everyone's hearts.
Oh, thank you, Sarita. That's very sweet of you. I really appreciate that. And I want to thank the CAHR board and the team in general for the lovely gift that I finally got. The poor delivery guy, I wouldn't let him in the building thinking it was somebody trying to scam me for something. So I ended up having to go to the post office to pick up my lovely package. But I do thank you. I'm drinking coffee out of the mug right now as we speak. So yes, as Sarita said, I am a community researcher living in Vancouver and working in Vancouver, although I have worked all the way across the country since the early 90s. And I started this work primarily as a volunteer. I started going into federal prisons in the early 2000s and doing mostly support work, but the program itself evolved into support and training around HIV and Hep C and other infectious diseases. And so that kind of launched me into doing some peer training with prisoners themselves in federal and provincial jails and prisons. And I quickly saw that there was this common problem of recidivism where people that I was working with would kind of end up in this revolving door of they'd get released and 2 weeks later they'd be back in prison. So that was how I eventually started my very first research project. And it got funded in the very early days. I think it was 2003 of the CBR program at CAHR. And that just morphed into me ending up taking a job as the director of research at Positive Living BC, and then launching full-time into community-based research. But I've always had a special affinity to training. And so in the early days, and prior to HIV medications really being widespread in the early 90s or mid 90s, I guess, a lot of people that I worked with were going on disability and leaving their jobs. And then with the advent of antiviral medications, then people started to look for ways to return to work as they felt better, and didn't necessarily have the means or the ability to go back to the job that they were currently, or that they left before they went on disability. So a lot of people said to me, well, you seem to be doing research, and, what's that like? And I'd really be interested in doing stuff like that. And, is that a way, and are there employment opportunities? Is that a way to get back into the workforce? So I started working with a core group here in Vancouver. Initially was about 10 to 15 people. That's kind of grown over the years. And it's probably a core group now of about 50 people that we use, or I shouldn't say use, we work with in doing research, and they are the community members that I work with most closely and train. So they clearly needed to be trained in skills, but they had a leg up already with being able to access community members in ways that traditional research or social science research wasn't able to, really get into the communities and get the rich information that we love to see in social science research work. So I continue to this day, although I have to say I sort of was semi-retired through the COVID pandemic because, as Sarita knows, I've trained a bunch of the people that she works with on her projects, and it was very difficult to do training in person. And I tried a few times over Zoom, and I didn't really like the results. I couldn't see people and if they were taking the information in. So I kind of went on my own little hiatus until we were able to start training in person again. And now we're just starting to start those training classes all over again and working predominantly with community members. Although the last couple that I've done, we've had academic researchers in the group as well, and learning skills like conflict resolution and dealing with difficult behaviors, and personal safety when doing outreach work, that sort of thing. So translating some of the research work that I and others have done over the decades, and then putting it into practice with having people learn about how can they apply the skills and how can they apply the research and get richer information from the population that we all like to work with. So I think that's about it. You already said about the CAHR stuff. So yes, I have deep roots in CAHR, 7 years on the board, I think it was. Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a great time. I've always cherished my time on the CAHR board.
Thanks so much, Terry. It's my pleasure to introduce next Kelly O'Brien. Kelly is a physiotherapist and clinical epidemiologist with Canada Research Chair Tier 2 in Episodic Disability and Rehabilitation. She is an associate professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Toronto and cross-appointed to the Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation and Rehab Sciences Institute. Kelly, I was really delighted to see your name on the list of presenters. You won't recall, I was just a weirdo in a session at the New Researcher Workshop in 2009, but I was at a table with you and I wondered if you might consider being my life coach. At the time, you just seemed to have it all figured out. So now I'm excited to hear about everything that's happened since then and have you share with the rest of our attendees here today.
Sarita, thanks for that. It's nice to see everybody. Thanks very much for the invitation. Great to see some familiar faces. And wow, going back to 2009, because I remember taking this workshop many a times and have learned and been able to connect. Hi, everybody. As Sarita mentioned, I am a physiotherapist by training, and I graduated from the University of Toronto and was kind of finishing up my program there, and really didn't have that kind of light bulb of where I really had this extreme passion and wasn't quite sure where my clinical work was going to take me post-graduation. And I had the opportunity in my very final clinical internship or placement to work with a team at the Wellesley Hospital, which was called at the time, now St. Michael's, on the HIV and general medicine team. And that was a time where I had the opportunity to really see how the role for physiotherapy really came to connect in the context of HIV. So bridging the musculoskeletal fields, neurological, cardiorespiratory, and bringing all of that together with the complexity of, the context of the environment and social determinants of health. And not to mention just seeing a really dynamic interprofessional team in action. So I was fortunate actually after my graduation to be hired by St. Michael's Hospital and work with the HIV and general medicine team there. And after a few years working clinically, had the itch to go back to start graduate studies. I applied to U of T. I was admitted to the clinical epidemiology program. And at the time was one of the few physiotherapists in the program. I had specifically wanted to veer away from rehabilitation sciences specifically in order to meet other people and really develop skills in research methods specifically. And it was a fantastic program and a great experience. And many classmates who I remain connected with and collaborate with today. So I was graduated with my PhD in clinical epidemiology. I did a qualitative study exploring the experiences of episodic disability among adults living with HIV, and then had the opportunity to postdoc at McMaster University in the Rehabilitation Sciences Institute there, and looked at measurement. So swung the pendulum from qualitative to now developing an outcome measure to capture presence, severity, and episodic nature of disability. So since then, I was fortunate to apply and start a faculty position at the University of Toronto, which I've been since 2012 in the Department of Physical Therapy, with some cross appointments with the ClinEpi group and rehabilitation sciences as well. I have to say that CAHR has been a tremendous piece of the mentorship and development of my career over the years, having been engaged in this new researcher workshop, both as a participant and someone who's been involved in helping with some of the planning, and really sort of helped to bridge, the connections through across all pillars. And now I'm fortunate to be actually a member of the board of directors of CAHR, and this is my first year on the board. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Kelly. Finally, I'm so happy to introduce Shanoa. Shanoa is of the Sashigo Lake First Nation. She's a fourth-year population and public health PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, which is tough to do. Her doctoral research aims to explore the impacts of the dual public health emergencies of overdose and COVID-19 on urban Indigenous young people, and develop recommendations for a holistic, self-determined Indigenous response. Shanoa and I have crossed paths in our work at the BCCFE, and I've really been personally inspired by her approach to her work and how it centers Indigenous wellness and Indigenous ways of knowing, and it's contributing to social justice every day in the way that you do your work, Shanoa. So thank you so much for being with us today to share just how you do that. I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Rita. Wow, it's such an honor to be on this panel with such esteemed researchers. I myself am a very new researcher, so I'm also very keen to learn from everybody's questions to the rest of the panel, and hope that I can provide some sort of insight from, I guess, the field of the new researcher / still current lifetime student. I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, collectively Coast Salish, for folks who are not super familiar with British Columbia. It's what is now called Vancouver, and I live in the beautiful neighborhood of Mount Pleasant. As Rita mentioned, I am a PhD candidate at the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, and I am doing work on a COVID study as part of a larger cohort study. So while it's not necessarily a community-based project, a lot of Indigenous research embodies many tenets of community-based research as they align with a lot of Indigenous values of relationality and reciprocity. And the idea of giving back to community through our work, as well as being action-oriented. So how I got here, I am from a small town called Kemptville, which is near Ottawa. I was born and raised off reserve. Our reserve is in the far northwest corner subarctic area of Ontario. So after residential school, my grandmother never moved back, and we were just raised in various parts of Canada as a result. And so that has sort of given me this inherent passion for urban Indigenous health and how we are a very significant blind spot in a lot of ways throughout my life, just as a person existing as an Indigenous person, not on reserve, but also in research, not represented in data, not represented in healthcare. Our values are just sort of attached to this romanticization of community as someplace out there, like on the land, and not necessarily within cities and towns. I mean, I grew up in a tiny town. I didn't actually grow up in a bustling metropolis by any means, but I think the same concepts apply. I did my undergrad at U Ottawa in health sciences, and I moved to BC for grad school. I applied to a couple different MPH programs and one MSc in Epi, and eventually picked the MPH program at Simon Fraser University. Sort of as my ticket to the West Coast, I highly value, I guess, work-life balance, or maintaining sort of a lifestyle that allows me to have the energy and enthusiasm for my work long-term. And so I knew a lot of the activities that I like to do are just bigger and better on the West Coast. So I jumped at the opportunity to pursue grad school out here. I am an epidemiologist by training, I guess, through the population and public health program. And my love for epi sort of started late in my undergrad, just an epi course at U Ottawa with Rewa Dianandan, who's a phenomenal epidemiologist. And since then, I kind of tried to chart out a path that would get me into an actual practicing epi position. And I opted for a master's in public health ultimately because I think a broad understanding of public health is integral to epi and all things that are serving the public or communities, depending on how you work and how you frame your work. And from there, when I was applying for various jobs towards the end of my master's degree, I thought I really am very interested in research and strengthening my epi skills. And so I decided to apply for a PhD program. And here I am about 12 years into straight post-secondary, with the goal of still being an epi once I finish this. I'll stop there, I think, for now.
Big thank you to all of the panelists today. So today we talked about how to get your training application funded, talking to media, how to write and publish scientific research. But I think for all of the trainees here, the question that's on everyone's mind is overall, how do you become successful? So the way that this panel is going to work is if there are any audience members with questions, feel free to type it into the chat or use the question and answer box as well. I can direct it to specific panelists if you like, or if you would like to just ask the panel in general. If any of the panelists have answers that they want to jump in and feel really strongly about answering, great. If there aren't any strong feelings, hopefully we might get one or two answers. But there is one question that I have right off the top of my head that I'll kick this off, and I'll open it up to all panelists to answer. So on the topic of success, we've seen a very challenging 2 years where what we have considered to be standard success has changed substantially, especially looking for new opportunities. We've moved to this online format, so some of the strategies that the individuals coming through, the new trainees, have to experience are very different. Before COVID-19, how would individuals approach you for looking for opportunities, and how has that changed in the last 2 years? And I'll pose that generally if anyone has strong feelings. If no one has a specific answer, I'm going to send it over to Keith.
I can get the ball rolling. I'm sure the other panelists will have some great insight as well. Really, the way that people primarily contact me is, I guess, two ways. One is, in the past, it's been in person. So during conferences like CAHR conference, people will come up and introduce themselves, or I'll go to their posters and I get to know people that way. So in the last 2 years, that hasn't been available. And that personal connection has been, I think, detrimental. But the primary way that people contact me is through email. And for students looking for positions, what they'll do, or what the successful ones do, is they think a little bit about what their career, what they want to research for their career, and if it happens to fit with what I do, then they contact me. Those that are successful will have done their homework and will have looked at my webpage and understood sort of what I do, and maybe will have referred to some of the projects that we're doing. Will have maybe even read a paper, and that really makes that connection stand out from, I probably get 5 a day, dear professor, dear respected sir, because of your interest, because of your research expertise, I'd like to do studies in your mechanical engineering laboratory, which is not at all what I do. So it's clearly some people are just copying, pasting. So you have to make your reach to the person that you're interested stand out. And so you want to say a little bit about who you are and why in particular you're interested, a little bit about why you think that the lab you're reaching out to is a good fit for you, and why that lab would benefit from having you. So it does require doing some homework, but I think it's better to have fewer quality engagements than sort of a mass carpeting of applications where it's clear that it's not clear to the person reading your email that you've looked into seriously into that research environment. So take a little bit of time to do that. There's other ways that people have reached out through Twitter and things like that. I'm not really very good at that, so really email and my webpage are the main methods, and that hasn't changed at all over the last couple of years. So I'll end there. Thanks. Riley, you're muted.
Thanks, Keith. It's only been 2 years of this. I'll pass it over to Charu first, and then I'll pass it over to Terry afterwards.
Yeah, thanks, Riley, for that question. So yeah, it's a really interesting question about how things have changed. So I'll say, first of all, yes, things have changed. Then I'll cite some examples of how things are better in some situations and not so great in other situations. So something that the last 2 years and the fact that, most people have worked virtually from home has allowed, for example, I run the CAHR Institute of Infection and Immunity. Previously, when we were hiring staff, and these are highly qualified staff, right? So they are masters of PhD, they have experience in the area of infectious disease and immunology. Because we needed them to be available to work in the office, there was a limited selection, right? So even people that I hired from out of province had to move into province and be located in the GTA area for them to work. But that's changed now, because for the last 2 years, even people who lived in the GTA have not been in the office. So we perfected the way we work completely virtually, right? So even when people are now sometimes in the office or whatever, we're still doing all our meetings and all our work virtually. So we're now hiring people across Canada. So we just hired an assistant scientific director who's living in Halifax. We're looking for a couple more positions because of the turnaround of the institute staff, and we are now open to hiring people from anywhere in Canada. So for a workforce, that has become sort of depending on the kind of work that you do. It's opened up new avenues, both for people like me who are looking for staff and basically would have to let go of highly qualified staff because of their inability to relocate. And for people, young people like the audience today who may be looking for working across, I sit on the COVID-19 task force, and we have a whole bunch of research associates and everybody who provides support to the task force, and they're located all over Canada. So that's been a good change. The not so great part is in the lab and bringing in students. Because we do a lot of, all my research is biomedical research. So we need people and students who would have done their fourth year thesis in the lab or would have come through the lab. And as Terry pointed out, that we couldn't train people. We couldn't bring in people who we could train or have them work in the lab. So there's been 2 generations of fourth year students who applied to grad school that don't have in-lab experience. And that's challenging on both sides. Many people who run wet labs would experience that we almost never take people who've never worked in a lab before, because we just can't tell before they come into graduate school how they will be in the lab and whether they're capable of doing a wet lab research-based project. So that limits the number of people that we can bring into the lab. So my lab used to be 10 or 12 people before COVID took over, and now we're down to about 6. Because people are graduating, but I haven't brought in new people because it's very hard to find people who will fit into that phenotype. So somebody like me has to now rebuild my lab. So I'm actively now looking for, undergraduate students, graduate students who can be in the lab. So in that sense, it has changed.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'll pass it over to Terry. And I see that I also have a long line of questions forming as well.
Well, I'll be brief then. Yeah. So I think what I've noticed and what I really appreciate over the last 2 years, the difference is the amount of creativity that is really coming from researchers, both community researchers in my case and the people that I work with most closely. But Sarita and I worked together on a project here in Vancouver, which is the oral history of HIV in the late 80s, early 90s. And, talking to long-term survivors and hearing about that isolation. And I know Kelly's quite familiar with aging and HIV population. She has a project on that. And so working with community members through the time of COVID was really quite challenging. So it did kind of make us more creative in how we were able to reach people and reach out to them. So we did focus a lot more on, more of the giving back aspect of our research projects and the knowledge to action part of it. So showing people how that work impacted them. I just finished early last year, I think it was May or June of last year, I finished a 5-year project that was evaluating the peer training in federal prisons with men who are incarcerated. We had to get quite creative and spent the time where we were locked out of prison and not able to actually go in and work with the prisoners themselves. We had to focus more on creating a manual that would be the training materials that we wanted to leave so that the peer training could carry on without us being actually in the federal institution itself, because we're still not allowed to go back into the institutions. But the training is carrying on, and the people that we did train in peer education are putting that into practice. So seeing those types of creativity, as I mentioned and Sharu mentioned, we weren't able to do the training in person, even out in the community or in prison, but there were creative ways that were workarounds, essentially. We still want to get back to working directly with people. From my experience, that's the best possible way, and then you get a good sense of how much people are taking in and where you need to adapt. But I did really appreciated the creativity that people have shown.
That's a really good point as well. Thank you. Thank you to all three of the panelists for that. I see that there's a hand up. I don't know if we can unmute, but Kia, do you have a question? You might be able to unmute. If not, if you can type it in the chat as well. Oh, I can see it. It's on.
No, thank you. I don't have any questions. I was just really enjoying listening to everyone's experience. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great feedback to hear right off the bat. So in the question and answers box, I'll start reading some of these. So the first is from anonymous attendee. I've heard anecdotally from a lot of fellow graduate students that they would like to go into industry instead of academia. What are the panelists' thoughts on this, and what do they think the future of academia will look like? And the second part of that is, can they talk about work-life balance and how this plays into their answer? And I'll pass that off to Shanoa.
Hi, I saw this question and it resonates with me. I'm living it currently. So I just wanted to give my thoughts on it. I am very much considering going into industry. For me, industry, at least in public health, is really more like not industry. It's like health authority work, and in Indigenous spheres, it's actually like community work, so non-academic work or non-strictly academic work. Partly as a grad student who has been a lifetime student, as I've mentioned, there are pros and cons to that, of course, and I don't regret going all the way through. I will say that I've never not worked throughout all of my degrees. So I've always had jobs that are both relevant and different from academic work and research. I've had like teaching jobs and sessional instructor jobs, smaller teaching jobs and TA, RA positions and things like that. But I definitely think that for the most part, among my friends who are considering industry instead of academia, there is a huge financial burden on a lot of graduate students who, despite having funding such as CAHR, which I currently have a doctoral award, it's just not enough to live off of. And a lot of postdoc positions are just financially not competitive compared to a lot of entry level, or I mean, it's not entry level if you have grad school experience, but new grad students, newly graduated grad students go into a competitive market, and postdoc experiences and some new assistant professor positions, as well as part-time positions, are just not meeting the needs of new grads anymore. And that's something that academia as a whole definitely needs to address, as well as work-life balance. Some of these positions also demand a tremendous amount of unpaid or cheap labor from people who are graduating as experts in their field, and so are not being paid as such in academia where they would be in industry. And so that's another factor. And to get an academic job, I mean, this is something that might be changing thanks to our work from home, our adaptations, innovations due to COVID. But if you want to work in academia, there's only so many places you can go. So there's, if you want to work in a certain town or close to home, you have to land a job at specific institutions. It's not like you have a couple different companies in each city to choose from. It's very specific, and that is another barrier for folks who are trying to balance their work and their life and their cost of living.
Thank you very much for that. I will pass it over to Sharu.
So thanks, really good question. So I guess I'll start out by, again, giving some pros and cons to both sides, because I don't think there's a clear answer. Everybody has to really figure out what works for them. But if I were to summarize, should you stay in academics or should you go to industry? My question back to you would be to say, are you a doer or are you a driver of work? Right? Because if you are a doer, then you can fit into any industry, because industries work on specific projects and the mandate comes from top down. Right? So I've collaborated with many colleagues who are in that area. When I was doing my postdoc, I was working on chlamydia vaccines. We were collaborating with an industry partner. We were in the middle of doing the work, and suddenly the company said, we're not interested in chlamydia vaccines anymore. That's not viable for us. It's not a commercially viable proposition. So that got dropped and they switched to other things. Everybody who on the team that I was collaborating with was redirected to doing other things. So that's an extreme example perhaps, but I guess what I'm saying is that the options of what you choose to do in industry, and I'm not talking of NGOs or community-based work, really come from top down and what the priorities of that pharmaceutical company or that partner might be. If it's a spin-off, again, there's very crazy drivers of that work if you're working in a spin-off. Right? People work 15, 16 hours routinely because you are driven to deliver so that your spin-off can actually become a bigger company. On the other hand, in the academics, it's tough. I mean, ask anybody who's running a research lab here. You're constantly writing grants, keeping your lab funded, getting any extra funding. It's a challenge. But the question or the rewarding part is that you get to decide what you want to work on. Right. So somebody like me, I started in mucosal immunology, looking at IgA and how sex hormones regulated IgA. I switched to HIV because that was a more interesting area. Over the years in HIV area, I've done everything from cell signaling pathways to making mouse models to doing now clinical research and clinical studies. I decide what my questions are and how I'm going to get it funded and what kind of research I'm going to do. So I think that's a very different, so people need to, when they're considering where they want to go, it's really about determining, do you want to decide what you work on and how you work, or are you okay with other people telling you, how to work? The initial part of your career, when you finish your master's or PhD, is hard work regardless of where you go. So it's only when you get up to 15, 20 years into that you can sort of determine your own schedule. And even then there are drivers depending on what job you're doing. So I wouldn't say that working in the industry is a cushy 9-to-5 job, but working in academics is kind of like you're driven by labor masters. I think that really depends on where you're working and what kind of environment you're working. The primary difference is whether you choose to do your own work and ask your own questions, or you're okay with other people telling you what to do.
Thank you very much for that. And I'll also pass it off to Keith if you have something that you want to add to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Kaushik made the primary point that I was going to, so I won't repeat that. I think she hit the nail on the head exactly there. The one other thing with working with industry is that people have said to me, I don't want to do a lot of writing like I see my professor doing. So I'm going to go into industry because you don't have to do as much writing in industry, which is completely wrong. There's lots of writing. I mean, in industry, you're doing reports rather than, and you still write manuscripts, and it's still important for industry to publish their data at certain times. But there's tons of reports that you're always writing. And as someone with an advanced degree, you'd probably be someone doing a lot of that writing. You're also responsible for seeking funding. Industry, they're always looking for more funding, depending on the level of the company. But just the point that there is lots of writing in industry as well, and both are very rewarding careers. I would say industry in general pays better, but has less security than in academia. But academia, for those that can get a position that not everyone can, but some can get tenure track positions. Your position is secure, but your funding is not. It's really up to you to get your own funding. So there's insecurity on both sides of it, but both are, I think, great opportunities. And the government of Canada is looking to have more trainees move into the industry pipeline. So there are some some focus and some programs associated with that. But it really, I would say the main consideration is what Dr. Kaushik mentioned. Do you want to be driving your own agenda, or are you okay with working on a project and then having it move 90 degrees or canceled all of a sudden and working? And I was hired to work on an HIV vaccine, and I ended up working on a project where we were trying to find out a better way to sterilize or make non-infectious blood products. So something that I completely wasn't supposed to be doing. All of a sudden, my boss said, "You're now doing this," and I said, "Okay, yes, sir." So, thanks.
Still muted. If we have one last quick comment before moving to the next question.
I just wanted to add that something that I learned in my last 6 months or so of exploring whether to pursue industry versus academia, an option that was pointed out to me by a lot of my mentors in academia is that you can do both. It seems obvious now, but a lot of people do both, not necessarily at the same time. But for people who might be lifetime students, might be more interested in leaving for a while, having somebody else tell you what to do is not always the worst thing. It can also give you time to learn from other people and kind of help you figure out what you want, even if it's well, I actually don't want to do what this person's asking me to do. And then you can come back to academia or vice versa, or land that really nice academic adjacent position.
Thank you for all of the comments and feedback on that. The next question is one that weighs heavily on my mind as a PhD candidate. Do you have any advice for someone starting up a lab as a new assistant professor? And I might direct this over to Dr. O'Brien, because I feel like you might have insight on this as well.
Thanks, Riley. Yeah, this question definitely resonates. It still resonates because this is, other than forums like this, we don't really get much training in, how to manage, develop a budget, how to hire and mentor staff and trainees. And these are all things that sort of feed into managing space, acquisition of funding. It all comes into play when trying to start up a lab. And so, the advice I would give is if you're in an environment where there are other faculty members or other scientists who have labs, and perhaps similar to a lab of yours, whether it be a wet lab or a dry lab, I would say connect with them, send them an email, ask if you can go for coffee, and to gather their advice on some tips that they have for starting up. I would say, having, starting small is good. And sort of, in terms of the number of trainees and such that you're able to take on, often is a direct reflection to the amount of funding that you have. So, so often if you are hired into a faculty position, for example, you may be able to negotiate some startup funding fees, and those startup fees can directly go to funding aspects related to operations of setting up your lab, graduate students or trainees, for example, which is always really helpful. But I would say, I still have conversations with colleagues, picking each other's brains about tips on not just how to start up, but how to keep one going once you do have it going.
Thank you. I hope that answers anonymous attendees' question. I think it did a great job. I'm going to go slightly more rapid fire now, just because we do have quite a few questions. So the next one is one that, once again, I feel like most of these resonate with me as a new trainee. So as mentioned before, some trainees don't have that light bulb moment. What are some ways that one can explore career options and interests? And has anyone on this panel, when they were learning what they wanted to do, how did you find your passion? Dr. Kaushik?
Yeah, so, the light bulb moment doesn't always happen at the time you want it to happen. A lot of the time you kind of do the most obvious choice, and it's not just what you want to do, but it's also what you don't want to do. So you find things between that sweet spot of, I really love this, versus I'm okay doing this and it keeps me going, and I actually hate doing this, or I'm ambivalent to doing this. So those are all options to basically kind of keep yourself on track. And then the light bulb moment may come late. I'll give you my example, that my light bulb was, probably not through my postdoc, not through my PhD, but when I started out as a new investigator and I was speaking at an OHTN conference, and a community member asked me, based on the abstract that I was presenting, because we were talking about contraceptives, hormonal contraceptives, and effect on sexually transmitted infection. And they said, well, what about women who use contraceptives? As an academically trained researcher who was working on mouse models, I never thought about community. So that was kind of like my eureka moment to sort of say, oh, my research actually applies to women in real life. And that was sort of the beginning of 20 years of working with community, because they pulled me aside and said, can you come to our community-based conference? We'd like to know more about what you're doing. And then, I engaged with the community and the African Caribbean community, who are particularly, and that changed my motivation for my work. Yeah, I was committed to that. But since then, it's been kind of like a driver to say, I need to answer questions for this community because it's important. So I think you need to just be patient to see when that light bulb moment goes off. But as long as you can find that path between, I hate my work versus, I want to work 16 hours a day on my work, I think you're okay.
I'll also pass it off to Dr. O'Brien if you have a quick comment, and then I received a question as well.
Sure. I would say, if the light bulb moment hasn't gone off and you're trying to explore what to do after the master's and contemplating a PhD, is that the PhD is a huge undertaking, a lot of years, and ideally will end up as being the foundation for your future career. So it's really worthwhile to take a little bit of time to explore, some different opportunities, activities, collaborations with community, other scientists or faculty. And the way to do that is just, if you're asked to do something, I find like saying yes is such a good opening of doors, where you get to sort of see and experience different teams, different topics, different areas of research. And then, you'll be, I think, if the time comes that, PhD is the route to go, that you'll have a better sense of what you might want to apply your time in your future studies and your future career too.
Dr. Folk, if you have a quick comment on it.
Yeah, just that I think it's to acknowledge that for those in graduate studies, and not everyone here is in graduate studies, there's a lot of community researchers as well. But for those in grad studies, I think there's a lot of anxiety because you're going through all of this training and there's not a job waiting for you at the end of it. It's not like, and it's an oversimplification, so forgive me, but it's like if you're a dentist, if you're training to be a dentist, at the end, your career is going to be a dentist. So you sort of know what that pathway is going to be. You're being trained in a grad studies, and for example, get a PhD. You're not being trained for a job. You're being trained with a skill set, and that's how to think critically and how to be to work on a project and how to analyze things. That could lead you a number of different paths from academia to industry to working for Dr. Kaushik at III. There's fantastic scientists that are working, driving the research agenda from the funder side of things. There's lots of different things you can do, but the commonality is that people have the ability to finish something that they start and they have the ability to think critically. And those are really important skill sets. So I think it's important to acknowledge the anxiety of students that there isn't a job waiting for you. So that's a challenge. The advantage is that there's lots of opportunities for you. You're not limited because you've decided to do a PhD in immunology of infectious diseases. You even though you've done that, you've completed it, there's still lots of things available to you to do after that. So it's I think the main thing is acknowledging the anxiety of not having a job waiting for you, but also that's an opportunity.
I want to thank you specifically for that, Dr. Folk, because my dad is a dentist and we have that exact same talk every once in a while. So the next question that came through, it's going to be a two-parter, and I'm going to direct it to Mr. Howard. So the first part is, any thoughts on avenues and opportunities in community-based research? And the second part of that is, any tips or strategies on reaching out to the community, especially if the career has taken you to a new location?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Monica. Thank you for asking it. I think that the cornerstone to working with community is building a relationship. So whether it's in the location that you've been in for 50 years, or you're moving to a new location, look at ways of educating yourself about the community that you do want to work with, or multiple communities if you want to work with them. Find out the people that are doing work with communities in the area that you're going to if you are moving to a new location. If you're coming to the West Coast, Sarita is the gold standard as far as working with community people. And yes, absolutely. And Shanoa, I don't know you, but I'm sure you will be too. But reach out to people that are working with community, and find out who community leaders are. Find out what the research experience has been with those community members, because that's really important. A lot of communities have been either over-researched in their view, or come from trauma and bad experiences with academic researchers. So you might have a little bit of repair work to do there. But if you've got somebody like me who works with community and brokers relationships between researchers and community members, that's a good way to establish, find out from that person what's the best way for me to approach this community that I want to work with. And then, always go in with the attitude of working with people, and be prepared to elaborate on how you're going to change, how you're going to share the information that you learn with that community, and tell them about how that work will impact them. Because everybody that I work with on research projects, they always want to know, well, why was it important for me to be a part of this research project? So I always try and answer that question when I'm giving the information back to community members. The impact that their particular input has had on the research project. Why was it important, and how does it benefit community members?
Thank you so much for that. There is one final question, and we are slightly over time, but I think it's an important one. So I will let whoever's hand go up first to answer it. Do you have any suggestions how to improve teaching research methods at undergrad and graduate students level to increase new researchers' interest? Dr. O'Brien.
Thanks, Riley. I'll be really short, and welcome anybody who wants to connect with me after the fact. But actually my teaching role in the university is to teach in the research curriculum in the physical therapy program. And I have such a passion for research, and sometimes that passion doesn't always translate throughout, the future physiotherapists going through the program that are just really keen to want to work clinically. And I would say one of the things is that, to think about, instead of things being big R research, but also consider program evaluation and where methodology and research methods comes into play, because whereby many trainees or learners might not pursue a career in academia, for example, many of us will be involved in different aspects of program evaluation, particularly the need of developing evidence to display our role and impact in the field. So I think maybe broadening it a little bit more may help. But again, I'm happy to connect with anyone offline after today as well.
Well, thank you. I just want to say, oh, no, we'll take a quick comment by Dr. Kaushik.
I was just going to say that, over the 25 years that I've run a lab, my own technique to get students involved has changed. As a young investigator, you're driving the questions and the research methodology, but as you get more experienced, it's always nice to give students the opportunity to develop their own research questions and methods. And I think having that initial investment in determining your own specific direction and what your research questions really engages people. And I find that I used to do that. I started doing that to graduate students a while ago, where in the first 2 or 3 months that they were in the lab, and I'd say, well, you're getting trained in the lab, but let's just talk about, what area you would like to pursue. What would be your specific question, to kind of get them invested in the questions and what they would like to specifically answer. And now I'm doing that more and more with the undergraduate students as well, because that's the beginning of understanding how to answer research questions. And then the methodology really follows that. And having people take ownership is really important, because if they decide this is what they want to answer, then it really engages them in that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And maybe I'll steal the last couple comments here. But I just want to give, once again, a huge thank you to everyone that's on this panel. Your opinions are so incredibly valuable for new trainees. All of your answers, absolutely fantastic. Could not thank you enough for being part of this. And I would just like to give a round of applause to all of you. We did some rapid fire questions today, but I think we did a great job at covering a broad scope of really what trainees need to know. So thank you for that. And I will just start beginning the wrap up for today's session as well. So today we talked about quite a lot of things. We talked about getting your application funded. We talking to the media, how to write and publish scientific research, and really what it is to be successful. We will be sending out a poll right now. It would be great if you could answer it to give us some feedback on the new researcher workshop, as well as the most recent session. Thank you for behind the scenes. So this tomorrow will be the first official day of CAHR. So what I would recommend for all of the new trainees that are still here, please try to attend as many sessions as you can. Pick and choose what you like, see different things. It's my fourth year being at CAHR, and it has been an incredible experience every year, whether or not that was in person or virtual. The other thing I will plug is on Friday night, there is the Trainee Forum. It's the first time that we're having this type of forum. It's going to be myself and a few other panelists, PhD and postdoctoral students, talking about the training landscape, funding opportunities, and bringing different opinions such as basic science, social, epi, and clinical sciences. So I would highly recommend that. And it's not just because that is my session. I think it would be great. Other than that, I don't know if I have anything else to add. I'll ask if Andrew, if you have anything else to add. If not, thank you all once again for joining the new researcher workshop. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I am the CAHR trainee representative for this year. Next year, there will be a new one. So if you want more information on how to become the trainee representative, it should be on the CAHR website, and you can email me as well.
Thanks, Riley. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.